This conversation is being hosted by the Trade and Economic Development Unit, TEDU for short, at the University of the West Indies. For some time, the TEDU has been using its national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The objective of these conversations is to ensure that the public is informed of critical information on and analysis of the economy in a timely manner. On this evening's panel, we have Dr. Buendra Tiwari, former Minister of Planning, and both the former Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Ms. Amanda Solano Badillo, Protection Officer at the UNHCR, Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, Retired Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, and Dr. Roger Hussain, Senior Economist at the University of the West Indies and the coordinator of the TEDU. So just a couple of meeting announcements, everyone. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you are not speaking. And please note that this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. This evening's conversation will proceed as follows. We'll begin with a presentation by Dr. Tiwari, followed by contributions from Ms. Solano Badillo, Dr. Gonzalez, and Dr. Hussain. And last but not least, we will invite questions and comments from you, our audience, either verbally or using the Zoom chat box. Thank you. So, Dr. Tiwari, just give me one moment while I bring up your presentation.
Christian, are you getting through?
Yeah, it just took a little bit longer than I expected.
Sure.
All right, is everyone seeing the shared screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right.
Go ahead. Yes, Dr. Tiwari.
I won't get to the slides immediately. So I will just speak to some issues, and then when I'm ready for this slides, Christian, I will let you know, okay?
Okay, great.
All right, and let me start by saying good evening, everybody, and I'm glad to be once again at this TEDU forum of the University of the West Indies, and I want to say hello to all of my panelists and all of the people who are on this particular chat. I would like to start by making a few preliminary remarks. And that it goes something like this. Venezuela has become the most recent and most urgent case of developing country migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees fleeing in large numbers to other developing countries. I emphasize that because Venezuela is second only to Syria, in which we had refugees and asylum seekers and migrants from Syria, over 6 million, about 6.5 million. And together with that, we had the same sort of situation, perhaps to a lesser degree, in terms of numbers from the South Sudan, And there are other countries that are involved in this. One is Myanmar, but I want to emphasize just for 1 minute, Afghanistan, where the refugee situation is going to become very bad now, that you have a situation in Afghanistan where the US is pulling out of the country, the Taliban are taking over. The UN has called for borders to be open and people are going to flee that country. So I want to make the point that Venezuela is the second largest in a series, but that this issue of refugees and refugee crises and migration and what you call them, asylum seekers, is something that is ongoing in the world. And we are dealing with over 80 million people who are displaced in the world. So it's a global problem. And what is happening in Venezuela and impacting on the rest of the hemisphere, including Trinidad and Tobago, is part of this set of global problems that are emerging today. The second point I want to make is that the US has always been an attractor country of whenever there are problems in Central America. You have people migrating there. Mexico has been a country with a lot of migrants to the United States. But you've also had a situation, for instance, in which over 1 million Colombians, when things were better in Venezuela, actually migrated to Venezuela. So what's the point of this? The first point was that we are dealing with a global phenomenon here, and that Venezuela is the second largest in the series that is likely to continue. And this third point is that the migration within the hemisphere is something that is really relatively common and happens all the time. And indeed, the whole Western Hemisphere has been founded on the basis of migration and built by migrants. Now, within CARICOM and within Latin America, there has been some migration from Caribbean to Latin America. So if you go in Nicaragua, you'll find a community, for instance, that is a West Indian community in Nicaragua. And so too in other parts of Latin America. But there has never been a huge wave of Latin American migration to the Caribbean anywhere. And therefore the Venezuelan migration of this kind and this quantity to the countries in the Caribbean, which are relatively small and English speaking, is a relatively new phenomenon, notwithstanding the fact that we've had about five waves of Venezuelan migration to Trinidad and Tobago in small numbers. I want to mention that the United States is the biggest and most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere, but 46 million of its people are foreign born. 53 countries supply the US with migrants, and migrants from these 53 countries regarded as the preferred country to migrate to. But I want to also mention the fact that 55% of all foreign people living in the United States are from the Caribbean and Latin America, about 25 million of them. And that a significant part of that, in fact, 65% of Caribbean immigrants to the United States in 2019 came from Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, but also from Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. And according to the World Migration Report of the IOM, and I quote here, Caribbean-born immigrants are among the largest groups in the country, that's to say in the US. Now, having said those things, I want to mention a couple of things which are important going forward, which is that most displaced persons end up in developing countries, although industrialized countries make the most noise. When you hear about immigration, the places you hear it from are from the countries of Europe, countries of the United States, etc. And it's a big problem for them. And you would think that everybody in the world, especially from the developing world, are going to these developed countries and industrialized countries. But I want to make the point that most displaced persons end up in developing countries, although industrialized countries make the most noise. Secondly, the vaccine distribution issue has triggered in my mind a lot of things, because it has raised some serious issues, in my view, about how the industrialized countries see the world and where the world might be heading. And therefore, I want to say that the vaccine distribution issue will accelerate the divide between industrialized and developing countries. I am saying that, but other people that have said that, and Ms. Gopinath from the IMF recently did an intervention, a report, in which she indicated that this was one of the issues that was going to emerge, because the time lag between industrialized world getting to not just 2 vaccines, but possibly 3, and a significant part of the world getting to 1, is going to make a difference in terms of the capacity to recover from this COVID crisis. So it's a major issue, and I think that we should not ignore that. Now, the third thing is I want to point out that the taxation agreements made by the G7 about corporations, that is to say that they will agree on the lowest possible tax for corporations, and no one can go below that. I want to say that that will have a significant impact on the world economy, but especially on the developing countries, because it will keep investment in the industrialized world. Once they agree on, let's say, a 20% tax anywhere in the industrialized world, I think that that is going to be a factor which keeps investment in the industrialized world. And when you take into account the fact that automation, artificial intelligence, etc., are proceeding apace, that will change the nature of work and eliminate jobs, and it will create the conditions in which even things like outsourcing that were available to developing countries before are not going to exist anymore. In this highly technologized world of competitive systems, what is the developing world going to produce that the world wants? I think that that is a very hard question that we have to answer. Because if you have all these sophisticated technological systems operating in this industrialized world, and if you have a situation where with the technology now they can even produce bananas under tropical conditions in a tent, the question does arise, what is the developing world going to do? What are they going to produce? if you have this widening gap in the economic system. Now, the key factor for humans in survival and sustainability is adaptation. The pace of change over the next 20 years will require swifter adaptation from humans and their institutions, including business and government. And when you look at the developing world, you are seeing a situation in which the pace at which the developing world, including our own country, is coping with changes in technology is not really significant, is not enough to allow it to survive and so on. And we may very well end up with three types of countries in the world: competitive countries, those that are going ahead and competing in the world and basically co-opting almost everything that you can think of. Perhaps a group of countries that you might call the limping along countries. They will survive somewhat. They cannot compete with them, but they might be able to compete in some things. And then thirdly, you're going to have receding countries. Those where the gap has become so wide and the impossibility of adaptation so challenging, the possibility of adaptation so challenging that they are going to face a receding future. The geopolitics also is going to become fiercer as the economic access shifts to Asia, China and India in particular, dominantly China. And as the world demographic shift to a larger Asian and African population in the world. And the geopolitics may end up having what you might call a racial dimension. I think these are things that we should take into account. New alliances may emerge, which may make the Western Hemisphere an ideological battleground. We are seeing it emerging already in a situation where it is already the most unequal region in the world. In this context, the politics and economics of finance, investment, trade, and development are critical, and the movement of people in this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, a matter requiring some careful thought and some repositioning. Because to talk about anything that is hemisphere-wide is to basically make a thrust against nationalism, isolationism, and increasing inequality. So in my view, the Venezuelan migration issue gives us an opportunity to make an intellectual intervention, first of all, in hemispheric design. And secondly, it gives us an opportunity to make an intervention in world politics of displacement and immigration. And I think that we should seize the opportunity to do that if we can. And that really brings me to the question of whether we should see this Venezuelan problem as a local problem, a problem right here in the Caribbean Sea, or whether we should see it as a regional problem, a wider regional problem, Caribbean and Latin America, or a hemispheric problem or a global problem. And my position is really that it should be seen as a global problem because it is one in a series involving others in other parts of the world, as I said, Syria, South Sudan, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and that is going to escalate. And as a world problem, we have to bring world resources to bear on this. And therefore, I will ask Christian if you can show the first slide, which is the one on institutions, if you can do that.
Christian, transition it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't know if you can see this slide, but what it says, it's a slide which says institutions. And on the left-hand side, it says political. In the middle, it says organization and management. And on the right, it says financial support. Now, if the Venezuelan challenge is a global challenge, and the other slides will show us that it really is, then you have to manage that in certain ways. You have to finance it in a certain way, and you have to have political organizations that relate to it in a certain way. So it's a global problem, but it's happening in the hemisphere, and we need to find a way to manage that. In the middle here are all the institutions that are involved in the organization and management of this problem now, because there is a recognition already that each country cannot manage the problem by itself. So you have the various organizations there. Let me make sure I say them right. WFP, that's the World Food Program. You have the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. You have MPI, that is Migration Policy Institute. You have CCHR, that is the Caribbean Center for Human Rights. You have OCHA, which is the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. You have Refugees International. You have PAHO and WHO because of the health issues. You have Refugees International. You have national task forces in some countries, not all. And what I'm suggesting is that we add to that a coordinating information exchange center linked to the various national task forces in a collaborative relationship so that we can have data, we can have comparative data, and we can have exchange of information of best practice so that we could deal with the immigrants properly. And this to also collaborate with the interagency coordinating platform, or RAV4, so that you have connectivity among the various institutions that are operating to help the refugees and to have peace and order in these societies. So basically, it's a system of organization and management for order and humanity. Now, in terms of financial support, now the Venezuelan migrant crisis is severely underfunded. It hardly gets anything close to what was done in the African crisis, and it hardly gets close to anything that was done in the Middle Eastern crisis in Syria. So I have listed here a range of institutions that should be part of the financial solution of these problems. Some of them already are, but I think a coordinated approach in which we can identify how much money is needed and where the money is going to come from, in what capacity, in what quantity, and for what purpose. This can be done if we brought all of these institutions together. And I won't read them out now because most people would know these institutions, even if they cannot recognize everything. But it really brings together the main financial institutions in the hemisphere and the main institutions that have been involved in refugee and asylum related issues from the world system, okay? So it's from the hemisphere and from the world system. And the political solution, since this is happening in the hemisphere, and since the Caribbean countries are involved, I would say CARICOM is key. I would say the OAS is key. I would say the Summit of the Americas, which meets once every 2 years with the heads, would be key. And of course, as part of the world system, we would need to keep the UN system aware of what is happening in the hemisphere, what progress we are making, and what we are doing wrong and what we are doing right, because you are dealing with human beings and their lives, their livelihoods, their future in this part of the world. So I would advocate that we take that kind of approach. And Christian, if you can share the other slides now. The one you had before, I think, showed the exodus from Venezuela.
Is that the one with the map? Oh,
yeah, well, that one.
Okay.
That one shows Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean as of June 2021. And it is from RAV4, June 2021. And it gives the figures for every country, etc., except that for Trinidad and Tobago, it gives a smaller figure than we know for a fact of Trinidad and Tobago based on both official and unofficial sources. So we put a little note there to indicate that difference. But what you see here is the spreading out of Venezuelans in the various countries of the Americas. And you would see as well the Caribbean countries that are involved, Aruba, Curacao, Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, and so on, okay? And then the other map shows the exodus from Venezuela. So you have a small Venezuelan map, and all those dots around there are really countries to which they have gone. So you see in the very north, you have Canada. In the very south, you have Argentina. On the east into Europe, you have Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And in the Americas, you have all of these countries here that surround Venezuela, whether they are in South America, Central America, or the Caribbean, okay? And that accounts for the migration pattern from Venezuela over about a 6-year period. And the next slide is really the Venezuelan migration worldwide between 2015 and 2021. And here you see the dramatic rise from about 750,000 in 2015 to 4 million in 2019 to 5 million in 2020. And in 2021 up to now, about 5.5 million. And it may well get to 6 million. And there have been predictions, depending on how much worse the situation gets, or if it gets better, maybe less, there are predictions that it could get as high as 7 million. But in any case, it is the second largest migration right now out of a country in the world, second only to Syria. And then you have one more slide where you have, no, this is the graph with the red and the blue bars, the red and the blue bars. You have that?
I'm sorry, I don't believe so.
Dr. Tuar, we have a table for that. I can share that with you.
All right, okay.
Okay.
And what it says basically is that the number of migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean region is just over 4 million. And the total migrants worldwide is just under 6 million, about 5.5. So basically the bulk of the migrants are in fact in the Western Hemisphere. So it's a global problem, but with the highest hemispheric impact. Okay? So given what we've said about the Venezuelan migration challenge and what we've said about our own migration patterns in Caribbean and Latin America, and given that we are a country, we are a region, sorry, that migrates a lot and go to other countries, including the United States, the question is whether we have the disposition to accept these immigrants and whether or not we are going to play the role that is required. And the issue also is what kind of economic help do we need? Now, the three things that I mentioned were political institutions, organization and management, and finance. The question would be, why do we need these things? And the reason why we need these things are, first of all, you have host country issues. You have economic challenges in the host country. If you could take a place like Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, not only do we have economic challenges of our own, we now have COVID on top of it. So, okay, so the second thing is that the economic challenges help to determine the quality of the host-guest relationship. When things are good, a country can be very welcoming. But when things are bad, the host-guest relationship could be very antagonistic and xenophobic. And we've seen situations like that in Trinidad and Tobago where Venezuelans have decided it's better to go back to Venezuela than to stay here. The other thing is the registration of immigrants. We have a problem in which we've registered 16,000 or so, but we have not registered another 25,000, 30,000, 35,000, 40,000, depending on what you feel is the real number. And Dr. Hussein talks about the fact that registration of all the people who are Venezuelans and present here is a necessity. You need a reliable data and statistical system which now takes into account this new influx. You have a pool of workers which you have to manage in a certain way. You have to create the conditions for jobs and incomes for adults. You have to have a detailed profile of immigrants so you can make best use of them. You need to have social support until adults get jobs. You need support for the children with schooling, health services. Does the country have a development plan? How does immigration fit into that strategy? Many scholars see migration as a tool to reduce poverty and promote development. How can we make that work in that way? And you need to create a pathway to legalization, registry, residency, and citizenship. Now, we have created a pathway for registration, but that is as far as we have gone and renewed the registration. Now, the other thing is that how long can we continue with this distinction between legal and illegal? And we've got to feed and shelter. We need to make information available. We need to provide work. We need to address the question of language difference, culture, safety, access to schools and health services. And at some point, as human beings, we've got to take into account that people who would come here also have a need to belong, to be part of this society, and a need also to be able to contribute and feel that they are making a difference. These are two key needs identified in the literature. We need to make sure of adherence to international law, humane and fair application of local laws, the management of the integration process to make sure that it is free of tensions and so on, a lot of which we are not really doing now. All of this is, of course, premised on the fact that immigrants bring value added when they come as immigrants to a society. And that is a case that we argue in the work that we are doing, and in which Roger Hussein has coined the term demographic dividend, that they bring a demographic dividend with them when they come to a country such as Trinidad and Tobago, because they are bringing so many things: human and intellectual capital, social capital, structural and organizational capital, consumer capital, because they buy. And also, they can eventually become investors. They have information about their home country. They are learning information about this country. That information nexus is important for trade. Some of them may be entrepreneurial. They have knowledge of at least two societies, and that can make a very, very big difference. Now, having said that, the issue does arise: how does a country do this when they are having financial and economic problems on their own? And I want to say that it's very, very difficult. And that is why the financing is necessary. When we look at other parts of the world, countries have national plans and programs to be able to deal with migrants, and these things are funded. They have a plan of action, and these things are funded. And we have not had that kind of situation in the region to any great degree. Colombia, I know, has had some money, and other countries have gotten small amounts, but we have never had the level of funding to be able to do that properly for all the countries. And if we wanted to do this business of migration properly, we would have to address not just the internal problems within a country and the management of the problems within a country, but the financial support that would allow for budgetary allocation and application in each of these countries, whether it's Guyana, whether Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, DR, whether any of the other Latin American countries, and certainly in Trinidad and Tobago. But if the funding existed and the management of the internal situation with the various organizations that I mentioned, and there was collaborative work so that you could develop best practice everywhere, the settlement and resettlement of these people could turn out to be a harmonious, value-giving process. And of course, you'd have the political organization that would make an assessment of this from time to time and help with the sustainability of the program until we had begun to achieve something. Now, I think I have misplaced my document here, but yes, I have it here now. I want to read something from Christine Lagarde when she was at the European Bank. The OAS had already agreed that this Venezuelan problem is bigger than a hemispheric problem. And Christine Lagarde, speaking to an important audience at the time, said this, and I want to read it if you would just give me a minute or so to find it. And this is what she said. She said the surge of refugees in the last few years has reached levels not seen in decades, and the numbers could increase in the near future. The immediate priority must be to help the refugees who bear the heaviest burden, and too often, tragically, with better access to shelter, health, and quality education. Many of the countries neighboring conflict zones, which have welcomed most of the refugees, have stretched their capacity to absorb people to their limit. To support additional public services for refugees, they will require more financial resources. The international community must play its part. Those countries that have done most to welcome displaced people are to be commended. Some countries have been willing to receive large flows of refugees and done their utmost to provide them with food, shelter, and so on. Others, especially among advanced countries, should look at how they might increase their scope for admitting more refugees. Ultimately, however, one thing is clear. No country can manage the refugee issue on their own. We need global cooperation. And she goes on. First, strengthening the ability of labor markets to absorb migrants by enabling immediate ability to seek work and providing better job management, matching services. Second, enhancing access to education and training. Third, improving skill recognition. Finally, supporting migrant entrepreneurs by reducing barriers to startups and providing support with legal advice, etc. And she goes on, and this is the final part now. Demographic forces, globalization, and environmental degradation mean that migration pressures across borders will likely increase in the coming decades, and cross-border challenges demand cross-border solutions. Global policy efforts, therefore, must focus on better cooperation and dialogue among the affected countries. This includes fair burden sharing, facilitating remittance flows, protecting labor rights, and promoting a safe and secure working environment for migrants. Migration is a global issue. We must all work together to address it. Now, so it's a global issue, but what does that mean for us here? I have mentioned already the financial requirements and the assembly of financial resources that we need to bring into the picture to do it. I've mentioned the organization that we need to bring to the issue, both in country, as networks among countries, and with the UN system to make sure that there is synergy. And I've mentioned as well the political organization, CARICOM, OAS, the Summit of the Americas, and the UN, to make sure that there is opportunity not just for vigilance and oversight, but accountability and sustainability to make sure that the integration process goes well. But I want to take it a little further, and I want to take you back to the issues I was raising at the beginning about where the world is headed in this post-COVID environment, if we ever get to post-COVID, because it looks like this thing is going to be with us for a long time. The recovery process is not going to be easy. It's not going to be fair. It's not going to be equal, and it is going to exacerbate the inequality. So in that situation, should we try to deal with the Venezuelan problem as a migration problem, which is here and now? Yes, it's a hemispheric problem and a global problem, but we deal with it as one problem that has to be solved. And my answer is no. Look at what is happening in the hemisphere. Look at the amount of people from Central America that went to the United States over the last month or so. And they are now having a crisis about it, about the borders. And the real issue that comes up, the real issue that is important here is that whenever we have talked about the relationship of countries, we have traditionally, whether it is FTA, EPA, or whatever we're doing, we're talking about trade, investment, and development, and we talk about financial flows. We do not talk about people at all. We never bring them into the process. And I feel that the time has come to begin to confront this. And the reason I'm saying this is also triggered by something that happened because of COVID. All this thing about the vaccinated and the unvaccinated is an issue I can understand because it is a question of life and death. But this business of discrimination among vaccines for geopolitical reasons or for reasons of asserting national sovereignty and autonomy is something that I do not believe that we can condone as a world system, because once we get into that, we are going to have a serious problem, and weak countries are going to be in hell to cope with some of these issues if powerful countries make decisions like that. And I think in the hemisphere, given what I said about where investment will go because of the taxation strategy that is now being adopted by the G7 and the G20, is that you are going to have a depletion of global investment resources transferred from what would normally be developing countries to the developed countries, so that you're going to have faster rate of growth, higher levels of investment, and the technology-driven competitiveness in industrialized countries leaving these developing countries behind. So that there is only one hope for the Western Hemisphere as a region, in my view, which is, and the reason I'm concerned about that is because I am living here. My grandchildren are living here. My children are living here. And we live in this hemisphere. And the only way to deal with this matter in a very unequal society where the gap between rich and poor is very high in almost every country, including the United States, is that you've got to create the conditions in which you can have reasonable levels of investment, an abatement of the inequality situation, and a lowering of the gap between haves and have-nots. You've got to have the opportunities for investment and trade and development and entrepreneurship. You've got to have opportunities for education in all of these countries, or else you are going to have to build walls around the United States and Canada, and you are going to have to build walls again around any country that is prosperous in the hemisphere south of that. And I do not believe, notwithstanding the ideology of isolationism and nationalism and the obsession now with making sure your own people are okay, your own country, I do not believe that in this hemisphere we could go that route. Because the geopolitics of the world have already come out of the Pandora's box, and the shift is already taking place. And if we do not address the issue of equity in the region, better equity, it cannot be a perfect system, but if we do not address the issue of better equity in the hemisphere through trade, investment, and development, and I want to add, by the movement of people to where prosperity is and where jobs can be had, we are going to have a serious problem in this hemisphere. that is going to lead to implosion in country after country in this Western Hemisphere. And I think the seeds for that are already being planted. Some of the systems of the past cannot hold anymore. The world will not allow it. Decency will not allow it. And I believe that there is need for a rethinking of the order of management of the business of the Western Hemisphere, even as the world goes about its business. Otherwise, hopefully, we will have some influence on that. And secondly, the developing countries of this hemisphere must begin to have a say in what the future holds for the people of this hemisphere in terms of financial, economic, and social well-being. And I believe that that is the only way an intervention on this Venezuelan crisis will make long-term sense for this hemisphere. Because if you solve this crisis today by simply putting money into it, resolving it, settling people, etc., it is only a matter of time where another explosion occurs tomorrow. The Americans did not even see that once they decide to pull out, within a month of that, the Taliban would take every city except the major city, and it is likely that the powers of central government in the major city is going to fall, or the Taliban would outright take it over, unless there is some new intervention by forces outside of Afghanistan. So I am saying that we are living in an uncertain time. The unexpected is certain to happen. The unpredictable is bound to happen. And you cannot solve the Venezuelan crisis by dealing with that as a single crisis of the moment, this moment in time. You have to deal with that as a crisis which reflects the potential for crises in this hemisphere because of the vast inequalities and because of the issues that are emerging over and over in country after country, and because of the unfairness with which the industrialized countries are headed into the future, calculated, in my view, to leave a large number of developing countries behind. And that is where I will end my contribution tonight, hoping that I will generate some thought about what I'm saying. You don't have to think that I'm right or that I am predicting something that is correct. All you have to do is to be provoked by the ideas that I am raising. The Venezuelan crisis is not a Venezuelan crisis. It is not a Venezuelan Caribbean crisis. It is not a Latin American crisis. It is not a hemispheric crisis. It is part of a global crisis of displaced people. And the source of that crisis has to do with political and economic deterioration. And all of the countries of the Americas look to me like they are headed in that direction if we do not do something as a hemisphere to manage the situation properly. So thank you very much for listening to me this evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. For our remaining panelists, next we're going to go to Professor Gonzalez. And just a heads up, each of our remaining panelists, you will be given, in the interest of time, you will be given 8 minutes to make your contributions. Okay, Professor Gonzalez. Oh, you need to unmute because we're not hearing you just yet. Professor Gonzalez, I'm asking you to unmute your microphone, please, because we're not hearing you.
Okay, I'm fine now?
Yes, you're fine now.
Okay, good, right.
Good.
Well, a pleasant good evening to all, and thanks again for inviting me. Pleasant evening to all the viewers. I think Dr. Tawari has raised a number of issues which would take us a while to really discuss at any length. The issue about the global nature of the crisis, what is the relevant hemispheric dimension that we need to deal with, and how is that to be treated? Should we have an attack on it that deals with all the various aspects, so within the context of free trade and free movement of capital, labor, people, and so forth? These are interesting questions that I would like to take up at some time. I just wanted to, in my 7 minutes, to tackle the issue of policy action being taken to accommodate the Venezuelans in Trinidad. He did, in fact, touch on some of that in his presentation when he spoke about what Trinidad was doing to accommodate them. And recently, the IOM brought out a study dealing with the integration of Venezuelan migrants in Latin America. A very interesting report that came out last month, I think, or just a couple of weeks ago. And I had a look at it, and I realized that we need to look further at this question of the integration of Venezuelan migrants. I myself have done an earlier presentation where I attempted to look at this, looking at several areas where I felt that we were deficient, but I didn't really get into any serious policy recommendations. Now, from the previous work I did, I touched on a number of areas: the question of migratory status, the issue of health, education, housing. We also looked at education and the issue of social cohesion. We also looked at food insecurity. And I pointed out that basically the area of housing, social cohesion, and food insecurity, we weren't doing too badly. That is to say, there were still some issues there, but by and large, we were coping. One may say, how is it possible for us to cope adequately with social cohesion when they don't speak the language, or when we have issues of xenophobia and discrimination and labor exploitation and so forth? But I think relatively, and here I was looking at it vis-a-vis what was taking place in the other Latin American countries. And I think relatively speaking, Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of social cohesion, has not been doing too badly. I mean, in some of the other countries, what you see is openly a kind of discrimination and xenophobia, which in a way affects the Venezuelan migrant community in those countries. I'm not sure that we have that here in Trinidad. So what I focus on really are the issues where I think the areas where I think we do have some problems are really, first of all, the question of migratory status. I think this is a fundamental one, because if you don't solve the migratory status of these migrants, you cannot solve a lot of the other problems. A proper migratory status leads to the integration of these migrants into the labor market. It allows them to open bank accounts. It allows them access health as well as education and other services. So it is basic to their survival in this country. And what we have done is really to have a kind of registration process, which gives them a temporary status for 6 months. And we renew that for another 6 months. And I tend to think that we don't see the difficulties involved in that short-term process. From what I've observed in other countries, that kind of short-term approach to it doesn't give the migrant a certain amount of stability that they need to really to grow and develop and even survive in the country. They need to be able to see some sort of pathway to permanency, and some kind of, even though that may not be clear, but at least there should be some kind of incentive for them to stay longer. For instance, most countries tend to give more than a year. For instance, Colombia and Peru tended to give 2 years, a 2-year temporary stay. And I would have thought that after giving 6 months, you could then give something like 2 years for those who were there for 6 months, instead of just renewing it for 6 months. Because what 6 months does, and I believe we saw this when they re-registered, about 3,000 of them did not go back and re-register. Of course, some of that had to do with the fact that COVID had affected the situation, and a number of them have lost their jobs and they decided to go back home and so forth. But in fact, the additional 6 months that was offered did not, in a way, incentivize them to want to stay here and settle in any serious way. So I believe we have to look at this question again of our migratory status and begin to see how we could, in a way, look at this question as something that is not going to go away. It is here for a while. The crisis is not being solved. And in some way, we have, in a way, to try to facilitate their integration in a better way. So my point on this is essentially that we have to think in terms of some options for them, some future options, which allow them to graduate from this temporary short-term status into something that is longer and something which in a way will bring about some kind of permanent status in the long run. We may not need to go as far as Colombia. Colombia, as you know, has offered quite a long-term status. I think something like about 20 years. And I think they see the crisis as something lasting a long time, and they move from a 2-year temporary stay into offering something like 20 years. We may not need to go, as far as that, but at least to offer something that is a little more permanent, and which in a way would encourage them to really be here longer and solve a lot of problems that they have in terms of getting access to education, health, and so forth. So that issue of migratory status in my view is fundamental, and I think we need to look at that again. And this is not only us in this region that has to look at this issue. A number of other countries, including Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and so forth, they need to really as well look at it again, even though a number of them are offering a slightly longer period than we do. But moving on, we see, for instance, when we go into the specific areas, when we go into, for instance, health, we begin to see the problems there that have to do with the fact that they do not have access to some of the essential health services. In this country now, you have to be registered in order to be able to access basic health care, which basic health care means the health care from the health centers, and you do not have access to secondary and tertiary care, and you do not have access to prenatal and reproductive health care, which is fundamental in a sense, not to mention all the other issues that related to the NSAIDs, the basic issues about diabetes and heart problems and hypertension and so forth, which afflict many Venezuelans as they afflict members or citizens of this country. So those are issues that I think we have to come around to deal with. I think the last figure I saw published by the UN talks about roughly less than 50% of the Venezuelans are having access to healthcare, and a lot of them are undocumented. And if you're undocumented, you're not going to show yourself in a healthcare center. So that a lot of them are not being covered. If you talk to them, they would basically say that they don't have any health issues. But the fact of the matter is that they're not really sort of being captured in this issue. We also, if we look at education, we see problems out there. We have been making some strides recently, but we still have a large percentage not really being covered by the education system. In order for them to get education, they must be registered. If you're registered, you're then allowed to go to a school here if you want to be educated in English, and I believe this would be a basic primary or secondary school. If the government has room for you, or the particular school has room for you. Otherwise, what has happened is that they have organized through private means and through some assistance from the UN, they have organized their own education scheme. largely, of course, online because of the circumstances that have existed here. And they have were able to provide some kind of basic minimum education to children between the ages of, let's say, 6 or 7 to about 17. It's not satisfactory because there are a number of people who are outside the loop. I had a figure, but the figure probably could be about 60% of them are not properly covered. I think up to about June in the last report, that was more or less the figure that they were giving. So we do have an issue of in education where they are not being adequately taken on board. And we need to really look at that in terms of really properly integrating them. And finally, I would say that in the area of economic inclusion, we have issues. Employment is a major question. The economy has gone south, as we all know, and a lot of businesses have closed there. Businesses which were very important to them in the informal sector. So what we have seen is a lot of them losing their jobs. I think the unemployment before COVID was something like about 21%, and then it moved to about 41% with COVID. And that's why we see a number of them returning home because the jobs are no longer there. So unemployment is a major problem, and that would not be solved until we turn this economy around, until we are really in a position to really offer them some kind of better way to earn a living. And that is obviously going to take some time as the economy picks up and so on. But along with the question of unemployment, there's also the issue of labor exploitation. A lot of them are being paid below the minimum wage. I think Living Waters has documented that in 1 or 2 surveys. And we are not getting the full reports on these things. And I don't know how much of that is being taken to the industrial court. A lot of them are sort of outside of the mainstream. They don't want to really bring things to the authorities and so forth. So that in a sense, a lot of that is not being captured. So I would just touch on these basic 4 areas, just to point out to the fact that in the area of policy, we still have quite a lot to do in terms of improving their security here, as well as trying to integrate them into some meaningful way into the society. And that, as I said, basically would start with a fundamental change in their status, in their migratory status in this country. So I will stop there at this point and entertain some discussion as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. Next, I'd like to invite Ms. Badija to give her comments.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would like to share my screen, see if it's possible.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, we are seeing it.
Okay,
good.
Thank you. So, well, good evening, and thank you again to the University of West Indies for the invitation. I would like to share a little bit of the work that UNHCR is doing in Trinidad and Tobago with refugees and asylum seekers, as well as with organizations from the civil society who also provide support to refugees and asylum seekers. So in just as introduction, the UNHCR office, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, established its presence in Trinidad and Tobago in 2016, given the rising number of Venezuelans who were coming to the country. And ever since, we have developed different programs to tackle the needs of the refugee and asylum seeker population. In numbers, we have registered over 20,000 persons with UNHCR. And I want to explain here that our registration process is independent from the government registration process that was conducted in 2019. And we also don't have a limit on nationalities. So while the government only registered Venezuelans, we have registered all nationalities of persons who are seeking for international protection. And we have actually 40 nationalities registered with us. Although 86% are Venezuelans, they are not the only ones. We also have a significant number of Cubans, Jamaicans, and other nationalities. And many of the 16,500 individuals who were registered with the government in 2019 are also registered with us, but we have also accepted the registration of Venezuelans who arrived after 2019 or were even present in 2019, but for some reason they did not register with the national authorities. So these are, just to clarify, UNHCR numbers and not official government numbers. In the country, we work mainly with 3 organizations with whom we have signed agreements, which are Living Water Community, who is our biggest partner, and then Family Planning Association and Rape Crisis Society. We are also currently working with 2 other organizations called La Casita in Arima and Helping Hearts in the south, but we don't have agreements with them. So this is a different type of collaboration. One of the many of the challenges that the country faces is that although Trinidad and Tobago have acceded to the 1951 Refugee Convention, they have not incorporated this convention into the national law. So as a result, in the absence of a national asylum framework, UNHCR registers the asylum seekers and also conduct refugee status determination for some of them. I say some of them because we don't have the capacity to conduct an in-depth refugee status determination to all 20,000 asylum seekers. So we have to prioritize to those who are either in most vulnerable situation or at heightened risk. Then for some of them, we look into other solutions such as resettlement into a third country. And this on the right-hand side, you can see the documentation that we provide to asylum seekers and refugees. Another area where and to say that sometimes this would be the only document that asylum seekers and refugees have to identify themselves in the country. And this shows that they are protected under UNHCR mandate and therefore should not be sent to the country of origin or the country where they would face serious persecution or harm. Another area where we collaborate is on education access. As it was already mentioned by my predecessor, they faced significant challenges in acceding to the national education system. And for this reason, we have partnered with other organizations such as UNICEF, Living Waters, and others to support the Equal Place Initiative, which is an online platform available for children from 5 to 17 so they can have online education. It's important to mention that this was online pre-COVID. When COVID actually hit, we were prepared with this platform. However, even though more than 1,000 children benefit from this platform, this does not represent 100% of the children under refugee and asylum seeker status. So there is still some that have not been able to integrate into any education system for which we are advocating with the government to provide access to the national education system. Another area is gender-based violence, which is a significant problem that affects our population, mainly women, and for whom we provide legal assistance free of charge, as well as we conduct follow-up and case management to improve their situation in the country and to be able to move from the gender violence, away from the gender violence situation. We also support, with limitations, of course, but we do support medical assistance in the form of sexual and reproductive health services, and then we have provided this year over 1,700 free medical services that have benefited more than 700 individuals. In different areas, we have also provided pediatric and gynecologist support. And this year we have supported Living Waters initiative to facilitate vaccinations for foreigner individuals as well as locals, but with the advantage that they facilitated Spanish speakers who could translate for those who don't understand English. And we also have a program for cash assistance to pay for rent and food, as well as we support some food assistance for the most vulnerable, which has significantly increased over this year due to COVID and many asylum seekers and refugees losing their jobs, given that they work on the service industry, and because of the national restrictions, they were unable to continue working. We unfortunately cannot offer assistance to everyone, so we have to prioritize on the most vulnerable. And this is the reasons why people request cash assistance. And as you can see, the two main ones are actually at the bottom, and it was they were unable to meet their basic needs. This was 99% of the people requesting, and also unable to pay rent. So some of them received our support. However, we do have limited resources, and we also saw an escalation in the need for cash assistance during this year. So to summarize, some of the main challenges that we are seeing in the country affecting asylum seekers and refugees are the absence of legal framework on asylum, which makes it difficult for them to seek asylum and have a refugee status determination process conducted by the government. And this affects their chances of being detained and further suffering from deportation. It also limits their possibilities to access the country in a safe manner, and we have all read the news of accidents that have occurred at sea. And this limits the access to basic needs and livelihood opportunities, as well as restricts the access to education, increases xenophobia and gender-based violence, which are some of the key issues that the population has shared that is affecting them. And this would be my introduction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Badia. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Hussein to give his contribution. And then we'll move to a round of questions. Dr. Hussein?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, good night. Hi.
Yes.
So good presentation by all the previous speakers. Really detailed, elaborate, well-researched piece by Dr. Tiwari. Lots of stuff.
Dr. Hussein, you're muted. I think you just went muted again.
Yeah, are you hearing me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Right. So I said very good detailed presentation by Dr. Tiwari, well-researched. Very good comments by the two other speakers. It leaves us with a funny position that emanates through most of these conversations. Now, I watched the slideshow of Amanda, and I saw numbers of 20,000 or thereabouts. I think it's 20,358 if I remember correctly. And I cannot ignore, and we should not ignore, that a sitting commissioner of police in Trinidad and Tobago, who was a former minister of national security, which to me means one of the most knowledgeable persons in the world on immigrants and those type of matters, having straddled the both posts, indicated that there are 120,000 illegal immigrants here. And if we add on to that the 20,000 registered, let's call the government figure and the UNHCR figure 20,000 and bring it together, it's close to 20,000. So in total, we have 140,000. That's 10% of the labor force. And what I find disturbing is the lack of urgency and scientific approach in registering these migrants. And what I look at the way we manage the migrants, and it reminds me in a sense of the way we managed the gas boom from 2000 to 2015. Now, what do I mean by that? We had a massive boom in gas, and we let things unfold without appropriate guidance to the market when the market was going the wrong direction. So we let the market work as markets work. And so in the context of a single factor boom, the market worked in the direction of increasing the size of the non-tradable sector. So today, we have a very large non-tradable sector in Trinidad and Tobago. And as a consequence, the stock of reserves is disappearing and our non-energy export capacity is weak. Okay, so someone may say to you, after 2015, well, that gas boom basically done and we are on the tail end. So say something else. So fine. On top of that Dutch disease type of environment that the gas boom created, we now have, and this is an ongoing conversation sort of between me and Professor Gonzalez, we now have what we would call a Rebezinski problem. We have another factor boom in the labor market, leading to what I see as scary outcomes. It compounds the already enlarged non-tradable sector that the Dutch disease left us with, and provides a ton load. Let's say it's not 120,000. Let's say the commissioner of police is 50% wrong. So it's 60,000 or thereabouts. It adds 5% of the population almost, and 10% of the labor force to the economy. And if only 20,000 of the 60,000 is registered, then 40,000 are unregistered. And where would, and Dr. Gonzalez sort of mentioned this when he was speaking, where would the 40,000 unregistered immigrants go? They would go where you can't pick them up. He mentioned it in relation to health. If you are unregistered and you get a cut on your toe, you would go to the pharmacy and try to get some antibiotic under the counter and over the counter and some sulfatizing powder and clean it up and avoid the police or the radar of officialdom. It's the same. It's the same in terms of work. They would go to the little bar in the corner. They would go to all the little places they can get job. And then I don't know why we are not seeing that the size of the non-tradable sector would expand even further with all the with the exacerbation of all the negative consequences that we tried to fix at the tail end of the Dutch disease. We now somehow supervise. And I say supervise via a lack of intervention. So a lack of intervention, we are sitting back without intervening and letting this thing happen, the non-tradable sector expand even further. So I would just close off by saying this, the theme today is on institutions and policies, that we need the policies that would reduce the probability of a migrant working in the non-tradable sector. And I would add on to that in the informal non-tradable sector. And why we are not hearing the Minister of Planning, the Minister of Labor, and the other authorities on this, I do not know. Now, it may be that I don't understand this thing well enough, and they seem to. And fair enough, I concede that. But my training tells me that the unregistered will trigger a one-factor boom, which we call a Rebrzezinski effect, enlarge the size of the informal non-tradable sector with all the adverse consequences we are seeing now. And Dr. Tiwari mentioned that there isn't any major conflict between the Venezuelans and the Trinidadians, and I will tell you why. Because if the informal non-tradable sector is the sector that benefits the most from the Venezuelans, and that's the sector where the Trinidadians do not want to work, then there is no conflict up to, let us say, 60,000 Venezuelans. But beyond that point in time, and I understand a boatload came in yesterday from one of my neighbors who's a Venezuelan. He was talking, he had to receive some cheese. I don't know how true it is, but I see no reason for him to be dishonest. And if it is, they keep coming, as the reports from CJUS and ICACOS sometimes suggest, and we cross that threshold, the capital to labor ratio will become diluted, and then it would have negative spillover effects for the economy. So I would stop there, and I would attend to any questions that may come my way during the question and answers. But we have a situation on our hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. Okay, so we have a few questions in the chat. One, which I will put to our panel, in particular, Dr. Tiwari. Yeah, the question basically is, how do we actually integrate the Venezuelan migrants into their host economies in a symbiotic way? And of course, that is in the context, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, that's in the context of a declining stock of foreign reserves, declining stock of reserves without negatively impacting our reserves. Yeah, Dr. Tiwari, you will have to unmute.
Yeah, I think we'd have to take a cue from Dr. Hussein, which is that if you have Venezuelans who are willing and able to work, and you have a problem of foreign exchange, it means that you want the Venezuelans, or in fact, anybody who wants to work, you want to put them in import substitution sectors, or you want to put them in export-oriented sectors. So I would say that we have a serious problem of food imports. We have a situation of foreign exchange shortage. I was conversing with somebody who is very knowledgeable in this area. And he indicated to me that on the black market, the US dollar is now $9.50. So, and he says that there's an active trade going on there. And you know what happens when you have an active trade outside of the normal system in any country in foreign exchange. So I would say that we should try to put some of the Venezuelans into the agricultural sector. If that could help us to cut imports, increase production, provide food for the community in relatively good quantities, and save us foreign exchange, I think that that would be a value. The second thing is that the manufacturing sector is committed to doing certain increases in exports. In fact, they want to double exports in a certain period. COVID kind of interferes with that, but I still think that they are pursuing it. I would think that you would want to get them into the export side of the manufacturing sector. And I think that is important. And the third area is that I have always thought that if you have this large segment of people in your country who are Spanish speaking, it seems to me that is a natural talent pool on which you can build a strategy for tourism involving the Latin American area, not necessarily Venezuela alone, so that we might be able to use them in an organized, strategic approach towards attraction of Latin American tourists to Trinidad and Tobago, in order to build some capacity to be able to do that. So I would just mention those three things, because all of those that I mentioned are going to be foreign exchange savers or earners.
If I may ask a question to Amanda as she is on.
Yeah.
I would like to ask, what is the view of Amanda, not necessarily UNHCR, so I'm speaking to Amanda. How can we use, does the registration process pick up any information on educational skills? And how can we collect information that could help with some form of labor market assimilation and integration of the Venezuelans?
Yes. So the answer will be yes. We do collect information on education. And yeah, I was about to mention that actually Living Water Community has a study done on this, as they just wrote in the chat, a labor market assessment, and I think it would be of value if they could share their experience and results on this. But to say that even though like many Venezuelans and other nationalities are very well prepared in the professional arena, if they don't have work permit or access to a legal status, it's going to be very challenging to fully incorporate them into the labor market.
Exactly. So the other thing I would ask is there any further steps? Now, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we have you on. Is there any further steps that UNHCR can take independently as an international entity that could help with the improved assimilation of the Venezuelan to the labor force? And by that, I am suggesting, is there a way that you all can increase the number of registered immigrants you have? So are you all allowed, for example, to say, in the next 2 weeks, we are registering all unregistered immigrants in Trinidad and Tobago, so that you all could build up your database and therefore present that as a gift to the government or some policy-making entity? Are those things possibilities? Because it feels very frustrating. Certainly, I can imagine it's probably the same for Dr. Tiwari and Professor Gonzalez. We have been speaking about this for months, that no matter how much we put it in the public domain, no matter how much we recognize that the body and the block of unregistered immigrants has the potential to create something we call asymptotic stagnancy in growth, that it is not being done. Is there any possibility that the UNHCR, given their 20,000 number and the 120,000 number mentioned by the Commissioner of Police, so there is an intelligent reason why a very senior official has said a significantly higher number. UNHCR number is about 1/6 of the very senior official. Therefore, about 5/6 of the people here in that context are unregistered. Let us assume he's 50% wrong. Let's assume he's making an enormous error. So it's only 40,000 unregistered, which is still twice as much that we have registered. Do we have any institutional flexibility, any way we could increase the call for, just as we are begging people to get vaccinated, is there any way we could increase the registration call so we could have some kind of basic understanding of the facts? Because if we know the demography, the age, and other factors like that, like I said, so you said 22% of the people are less than 18 years. I mean, when you said that, I wanted to scream, because here it is, we have a chunk of young people that are not being properly educated, probably here for 2 years. What role will they have in a labor market that is globalized and skills biased? So I throw that final question to you, Amanda.
Yes, so just our registration process is ongoing. We register individuals every day, every week. We don't have a time limit for this, and we actually share our statistics with the national authorities, with the immigration division. We shared on weekly basis the persons that we are registering. So they do have that information, but it's basic. They don't have like the education profiles, which is something to be discussed in the future. And we continue to advocate for the government to and offer our support so the national authorities can expand the registration system or exercise. And I believe there is very good practices in Latin America that could guide the process. For example, in Colombia, where they are providing all Venezuelans with humanitarian temporal visas. So it's not a long-term solution, but it is a short-term solution and very much needed. And with this exercise, it would allow the country to learn who is living in the country, to give them legal access to rights, and also to pay taxes and contribute to the social security and so on. And Colombia is just one of the many, because Peru and Brazil have done similar things. That is something to look at.
So if I may continue, if I may build on what you just said, is the Peruvian approach, you mentioned Colombia, and I know in relation to CISBEN and the Venezuelans, but is the Peruvian, I think you use the term intertemporal, what's the term you use, intertemporal passports?
Yes, they are providing, I mean, it has different names, but it's a temporal humanitarian visa.
Right, temporal humanitarian visa. Is the Cuban temporal humanitarian visa in relation to the Venezuelans as well?
Yes, it's Colombia, Peru, and Brazil is for Venezuelans, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda and Dr. Hussein. So I have a question here. Dr. Tiwari brought up the issue of funding and how inadequate the funding is for the Venezuelan migrant crisis. Some figures that I came across in my research, for each Syrian refugee, the total spending comes up to about $3,150 per person. And we can compare that to $265 US per Venezuelan. So one thing that so one question I have, is there perhaps like a Mercosur, CARICOM joint effort that can be used to really engage the Americans and the Canadians to increase access to funding, or some kind of joint effort of Latin American countries to really push for an increase in funding to actually deal effectively with this Venezuelan migrant crisis? So that's my question to Dr. Tiwari.
Well, you see, that's why I'm advocating an approach which takes the issue out of any individual country and brings the international community into it. Right now, I mean, UNHCR, for instance, does the work because they have to, in a sense, because if they were not here with the absence of laws in Trinidad and Tobago, the people coming into the country from Venezuela would have no means of classification whatsoever. And in the, I mean, you need to have, first of all, you need to, somebody has to take responsibility for this project. The UN has been here. The UNHCR has been critical. We have local organizations like Living Water, etc., that have done it. And yes, the government has taken responsibility for registration of some, but as Roger is pointing out, there are large numbers of people who are not caught in the system. So we have to, in my view, you have Colombia doing certain things. You have Peru doing certain things. You have Brazil doing certain things. You have various other countries operating in certain way. Pointed out in my own thing that Panama and Costa Rica, for instance, you know, Panama is well organized with a number of international and local agencies to offer opportunity to the refugees and to make sure that they get food, they have basic attendance, etc. Costa Rica has also taken a humanitarian approach. But all of these things are done by the countries themselves, you know, trying to deal with the situation. I think what you need is really a hemispheric approach to this that is globally funded and organized in such a way in which the various institutions already involved play a role, like UNHCR and other institutions that are doing that. But it seems to me what is missing there is coordination and systematic accounting for what is happening that is problematic, what is happening that is of value, and what is happening that is helping with the process of managing the displacement and giving these refugees and asylum seekers comfort, opportunity, capacity for integration, and a sense of belonging in the place. So I don't think that can continue to be done in the ad hoc way that we are doing. We are hoping that the problem will be resolved, and there are big issues. And that is why I say that, you know, I mean, I don't see, we've got to settle the question of Venezuela, which is what is causing the refugee crisis. We've got to bring some peace and order and system to Venezuela. It needs a political solution. It needs an economic strategy. It needs some element of normalization. And each country that has refugees also needs help to do that properly. And you need the collaboration across the hemisphere to see what is the best practice, and you try to apply that. So I think what is missing is a responsibility understood by all for a systematic process of managing this challenge to resolution.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. So just one quick follow-up question. In your estimation, which of the institutions that you mentioned in your presentation do you think should take the lead in this? You mentioned a few political, some organizational, and some financial. Which ones do you think should be take responsibility for this? And even as I say that, I have a comment in the chat here that seems to indicate that this kind of coordination is taking place by an organization called R4V.
Well,
is that,
well, I mean,
yeah,
yes, they are, I mean, they are involved in interagency coordination.
okay.
And they are playing a role, but I don't know. You see, you have to have all things in place. I think you have to have all the organizations in place in a certain way. You have to have enough funding, and that is why the financial part is. And you also have to have a plan. In each country, you need a plan. You need a plan in Trinidad and Tobago. First of all, to register all the refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced people and immigrants. So you register all of them. And then within a national plan and framework, you have a plan for integration, labor market absorption, etc. But you have to work with a plan. And that plan has to be funded in some way. I mean, the government will do some of the resources they will simply take advantage of, like health or education and so on. But again, that has to be organized. I take the point, you have these children who are not going to school. I find that abysmal. It's going to have a long-term effect on their lives. And if they stay in Trinidad and Tobago and this economy, when they could be much higher level contributors. So I would say that I think in terms of political organization, I think the OES could play a role in this. I think CARICOM has to play a role.
Okay.
I think the Summit of Americas can play a role in the hemisphere. If you have an accounting responsibility, a reporting responsibility, I think the United Nations is critical because they are already involved. Were it not for them, we would not have anything here. And then the organization and management, I mean, all the organizations really who are now involved, the only thing I would add in that is some kind of connectivity with the informal systems that have taken place. So for instance, in Costa Rica, they have formed an organization with a few countries dealing with both Central American and Venezuelan refugees. In Panama, you have a different system. So these are, in a way, disconnected, if not isolated, networks. And you need to find a way of knowing and comparing what these networks are doing together and what they are doing right and what they are doing wrong. And the financial support, I cannot emphasize more. I mean, basically, this Venezuelan crisis is so large, 5.6 million people.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the most underfunded refugee crisis I have ever seen. I do not understand it at all. It is almost as they expect the problem to go away without any financial intervention. It is very limited, the financial intervention here.
Yeah.
You know, so, I mean, that would be my take on it.
Okay, I have a question now for Amanda. Amanda?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, hi. Yeah, so Colombia is typically held up as the Colombian model is typically held up as almost like a best practice approach to the integration of the Venezuelan migrants. So I have a question in the chat concerning that. Is there evidence of the economic impact of the Colombian approach? That would be the first one. And number two, is it possible for you to speak to the issue of these, almost like the severely limited funding available for this Venezuelan crisis in Latin America and the Caribbean?
So both are very relevant questions for which, unfortunately, I do not have an answer. Okay. Not having worked in Colombia before, it would be very difficult for me to give an honest answer to that question.
Okay.
And on funding, I think that's more a question to donors. UNHCR as such is not a donor. We actually receive funding from donors. We're international collaboration.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. All right. So, all right. Okay, so just a bit more information coming into the chat concerning R4V. Okay.
And if I could make a closing comment, please.
Yes, sure.
So it's a deep, meaningful conversation, and a lot of learning comes out of these various conversations. We need to now think about how we could encourage registration or deeper registration. As an economist, what troubles me most is the implication of non-registration. And I think that if we, the participants of the seminar, continue to explain and elaborate on the economic implications of non-registration in terms of the potential for capital dilution in other sectors, then it may hopefully find traction. But at some point, the policymakers, in my estimation and view, we need to get them to move the ball. Doing nothing basically means if the Venezuelans keep coming, doing nothing further, I should say, basically means if the Venezuelans keep coming, that the size of the unregistered population in relation to the registered would rise, and the greater the size of the unregistered to the registered is the greater the impact on the informal non-tradable sector. And there are real long-term consequences for economic growth as that sector increases in size. That's my closing comment. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your closing comment, Dr. Hussein. Next, I'd like to invite Ms. Badia to give her closing comments.
Hi, good night, everybody. I'm Kala Rijlal. I'm the Communications and Public Information Associate at UNHCR. Unfortunately, Amanda had to step away, so I'll just give the closing remarks on behalf of UNHCR. Thank you to the Economics Department for having us. We really appreciate being part of this very important discussion. And we hope that we have helped you all understand a little more about the work that we do. We also always look forward to hearing from you. And if you do need feel free to reach out to us if you would need any sort of information from us.
Okay.
I will put my email address in the chat, so you can feel free to email me and we can add you to our list when we do our monthly updates on the situation in Trinidad and Tobago, so you can all have a little insight on some of the work that we do. Thank you again, and we really appreciate being part of this discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Pejal, for your contribution. And last but not least, I'd like to invite Dr. Tiwari to give his closing remarks. Dr. Tiwari.
No, I don't really need to add anything. We have a major challenge with these immigrants in Trinidad and Tobago. I think part of the disorganization and dislocation has been because of COVID. But I think we need to understand that we have a serious economic crisis that is going to get worse, and that to address that problem, we've got to take strategic economic action and make strategic economic interventions. I think the Venezuelan population, properly managed, gives us an opportunity to do that. And I don't think we should miss the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. Okay, everyone, in closing, just to bring everything together, it is important for us as a country to make that push into regularizing the status of the Venezuelan migrants. It's important because if properly done, they can actually contribute effectively to the economy. And even if they are paid minimum wage jobs, ideally these jobs should be formal, and it will help their contribution to the NIS. All right, so there's a fiscal benefit, and in the long term, once they are fully integrated into our economy, they will help certainly deal with the issues we have related to the aging population as well. So everyone, I just want to thank you all for coming out today. And once again, thank you to our panelists for their contributions and presentations today. Okay, do take care, everyone. Stay safe and have a good night. Okay.